In the early 20th centuries, a mystery historical figure appeared in Russia, a man named Rasputin, a monk whose reputation among people that he uses his spiritual abilities to heal the ill and he has a vision to make him predict the future. In that time, Russia was ruled by the king Nikolai Romanov II. This is a picture of him and his wife, which was the last royal family that ruled Russia. Prince Alexei, the king's Nikolai son, his health condition was the worst. His mother, Queen Alexandra, Rasputin actually came to the royal palace and placed his hand on the head of the sick Prince Alexei, and suddenly they found that the prince began to heal and improve. This incident raised Rasputin's status very high in the eyes of King Nikolai and his wife Alexandra, and became very close to him. In a point of the story, this farmer he will be the ruler of Russia. Rasputin is considered one of the most famous historical figures, a puzzling, mysterious, and interesting character. Even if you wrote in Google the most famous monks in history, he will be in the third place. How could a man like Rasputin, who came from the peasant class and was a farmer in a small village, be able to reach the ruling family and manipulate them? This is a strange story, and it's actually two stories, the story of Rasputin and the story of the king's ruling family in Russia. The two stories begin separately, but they connect at a certain point in the story. Enjoy the movie. Georgy Rasputin was born in Siberia on 20th of January 1869. Siberia is considered one of the most harshest areas in Russia. Rasputin from his childhood lived a difficult life. His father was a farmer, as he was like his father, and his mother gave birth to 7 children before him, but all of them died in his childhood, except for Rasputin. Some of them died during the childbirth, some of them died while breastfeeding or at very young age. When Rasputin reached his early teens, his mother died in a fire and his father died of illness. So literally means life in hard mode. So the young man got lost and started stealing. After that, he began to become reckless, unethical, and entered into one-night relationships. And this reputation spread about him as a drunk, immoral thief, a full package. Rasputin got older, and in his mid-20s he got a wife. When he reached the age of 28, he had 4 children from her. Although he had a family with responsibilities, but he still drunkard, immoral thief. Never left any of his old habits. He was even cheating on his wife, and his wife knew but still stayed with him. I don't know, how he manipulated her to this extent to stay with him while he's cheating on her. Anyways, one day Rasputin stole a horse, and a horse in their days was something so expensive. The owners of the horse kept chasing him until they knocked him off the horse and were able to catch him. In the end, begged them to forgive him. They told him, "We will let you go, but you gotta leave the village." So he was forced to leave the village and abandoned his children and wife. After a period of wandering and living in the wilderness, he decided to seek help from the church. Rasputin entered the church, the religion of the church, and began to learn the techniques and the teachings of religion in the Orthodox way. He remained consistent in these matters, the church matters, until he became a monk. After a while, a word began spread about him that he has spiritual abilities. I think he is the one who spread these words. Look at him, man. These spiritual abilities are supposed to treat the sick people and heal them. Rasputin began going to sick people, curing them and doing spells on them. The strange thing is that some of these people who is trying to cure them, they were actually cured and much improved by him. So word began to spread about him that this is a blessed monk who heals people. The explanation of many researchers about Rasputin's powerful abilities of treating people, that he was actually treating them in the psychological way. No one in that time was interested in the psychological way. Things like stress, depression, feeling sad did not have any cures or therapies at that time. Rasputin was playing in this exact point. He had a social and emotional intelligence and knew how to talk to people and deal with them. Like this kind of intelligence you get from scammers. He knew how to make people feel better and how to get them optimistic and get them out of the depression they're in. And listen to me, my friend. When people feel better, they think they are cured, and this is a blessing from God, especially when he was linked to the church and he was playing the role of monk. This reputation spread about him, the monk who heals people. Rasputin started a journey that he called a pilgrim. He would travel and move from city to city and visit churches and holy places. Before he reached a place or city, his reputation came before him, as people run to him from everywhere. He sits with them and performs his ritual for them, while at the same time making them relax and comforting them. So Rasputin was trying to play the role of monk and holy man to the best of his abilities, but the life of monk was so strict for a man like him. As we said, this person was alcoholic and stud and who did not like the restrictions placed on him by the church and the religion. At the same time, he needed the religion character to market himself. Days pass and Rasputin found a religion group for himself. They called themselves Hales. This was a group affiliated with the Orthodox Church. This means that they consider themselves to be a part of the church, so they are basically members. This religion party is normal for them to go to church and practice the same normal rituals, but at night they hold isolated meetings among the trees and forests, gathering in an open place and perform their own rituals, dancing in a crazy way, hitting each other, making strange movement and weird stuff. And after this ritual, they throw a sex party. Why do you think that? Because in their way of getting closer to God, the more sinners they do, the more closer they get to God. That's the best way of getting closer to God in their own ways. So when our godly man heard about this group, he was so happy about it. He said, making sins and becoming closer to God in the same time, this is the deal or nothing. So Rasputin joined them fully in this religion group and considered himself that he is inside a bank stud, but in the outside that he is a man of God and a monk. And it seems almost that he has a religion of his own, like he made this religion to suit his lifestyle. He continued his pilgrimage, moving from city to city, and his reputation spread everywhere in Russia. At the same time, when Rasputin was building his name and wandering in the Russia land, Russia was ruled by the king Nikolai Romanov II. Nikolai, his father, the former king, died in the year 1800. His death was surprised at the time when Nikolai was only 26 years old. He was not fully prepared to inherit his father's crown. The Romanov family ruled Russia for over 300 years, so Nikolai inherited the Russian Empire when it was at the peak of its expansion. He inherited wealth, luxurious places, and gold and diamond and mines and all of it. Of course, he inherited the absolute power of ruling people of Russia. Nikolai, the beginning of his rule was under the shadow of his uncle, Sergei, who was to a large extent controlling him and directing all of his movements. Especially Nikolai, he was just a young man and had no experience in political matters or matters of ruling the country, so his uncle Sergei had a great influence on him. Nikolai was married to the Princess Alexandra Fyodorovna, who was a great-granddaughter of the Queen Victoria of England. At the time, many nobles of the European countries were marrying each other. So you can find the noble of German prince marrying the noble of England marrying the noble of Russia. They are like making political marriage. But unlike the usual marriage in the high classes, the marriage of Alexandra and Nikolai was not political. Their marriage was for love. The first time they meet was at wedding party of Nikolai's uncle Sergei, which we talked about a while ago. His uncle Sergei married Alexandra's sister. Nikolai was 16 back then and Alexandra was 12 years old. Both teenagers, they fell in love with each other at first sight. Love at first sight. And when Nikolai grew up, he declared his desire for marrying Alexandra. His uncle and his wife were the first accepting of this decision. Indeed, Nikolai and Alexandra were married in 1894. And now focus with me. Nikolai and his uncle were married to the same family. They married two sisters, and this made them way closer to each other. Alexandra considered herself a very religious woman, and she loves monks. This was one of the main reasons why she loved Nicholas, because he shared the same aspect with her. Common stuff. So keep this in mind because it's very important point when their two stories interferes with each other. Rasputin and the queen and the king. After their marriage, a short period of time in the same year, the king Nicholas' father died and Nicholas became the king and his wife Alexandra became the queen. After a while, the time came for the official coronation ceremony, and for a large occasion like this, she should organize a huge celebration. A public feast was announced for all the people in a large square that they used for the army. The responsible for this organization and this feast is Nicola's uncle Sergei. Some of the palace advisors were afraid of this feast and were telling the king Nikolai that they must increase the number of soldiers and police for organizing this celebration. But Sergei, Nikolai's uncle, told them no need, I appointed a sufficient number. And in fact, the day of the coronation came and a large movement of common people and peasants and farmers began to attend the promised feast. Sergei was expecting from 200k to 300k people to come, but the number of people arriving was closer to 1 million. Imagine, about 5x the number that was expected. The scene was crazy. I mean, look at this shot. For example, this is a real historical shot. The number was scary. The problem here is that the square were so unusable. As we said before, it's used for training of the military. The land was dug, rugged, and very damaged. It wasn't an easy land for people to walk on. So they put together some weak wood to level the ground up, so just like to help it for this day. But with the great crowding, disaster became. The crowds and many of the people who were in middle of the chaos began suffocating. They couldn't breathe. Terrifying number of victims died in this day. There is a historical photos for a large areas in the ground that were filled with victims and bodies of people. Imagine the extent of the tragedy that happened with the huge number of people that were present in that day. The news of this disaster reached the king, so the first thing he did was to go to the uncle Sergei, who was responsible for this organization. He told him how many had died, and his uncle replied, "We have not confirmed the number yet." And the king told him, "How much? Are we talking in 100 or more?" So his uncle replied to him with a shocking sentence, "Unfortunately, I fear that we're not talking in hundreds, we're talking in thousands." Here Nikolai was shocked and immediately said, "Okay, we have to stop the celebration." His uncle told him, "No, I don't recommend this thing." He said to his uncle, "At least announce that there is a tragedy. We can't just ignore this stuff." His uncle told him, "No, I don't think that it will be a tragedy unless we make it one." Nikolai was affected by his uncle's word very easily and manipulated, and he was his closest advisor after all. And imagine how much he could convince him that he was ignoring the death of thousands of people in the day of his coronation. Crazy stuff. So they continued the celebration normally, and the bodies of the victims were just put in the cars. And when they finished greeting the people, they continued their celebration inside of the castle. It was so normal for them, like nothing has happened. Dancing, eating and drinking, a party inside of the castle. From that day, a new title for the king began to spread out. Nikolai the Bloody. Obviously, it was not used openly by anyone, but I mean people among themselves were using it, especially people who hated the king. So this was the worst beginning that a ruler and his people could make. It seems that this start was a bad omen for this country. Time passed and almost 10 years had been passed since Nikolai took over Russia. During these years, he and his wife had 4 children, but all of them were daughters: Tatiana, Maria, Olga, and Anastasia. Of course, this was frustrating for them because they wanted an heir for the throne, and the heir must be a boy. And all these years they have been trying, but they always got a girl. But finally, after a long wait of time, their wish came true. In the year of 1904 of this year, finally a baby boy came to them, and they named him Alexei. Of course, the Prince Alexei automatically became the heir of the throne of the Russian Empire. But Prince Alexei had a major problem, that he was sick with a disease called hemophilia. This is a rare family disease that was spreading between them. If a person has this disease, if he gets any wound, even if it's a small wound, he continue to bleed without stopping, because the blood does not clot at all. Any normal person who does not have this disease gets a wound, it continues to bleed for a while, and then the blood begins to clot and the wound heals. But for those people who have hemophilia, their blood does not clot, so their wounds do not heal, and this causes them several altercations. Most of them die, even to the extent that most of them die in a young age. Nicholas and Alexandra were aware of this disease because it was spreaded disease among the ruling families in various European countries, because many of these marriages were considered marriage of relatives. This was the case of Nicholas and Alexandra. They were cousins in the 3rd level. This caused their son Alexei to become infected with the family disease hemophilia. Their joy quickly turned into sadness when they discovered this disease from the moment he was born, and they cut this robe that in the belly. They noticed that his blood was not cluttering at all, and that his bleeding was continuing. This was a great shock for them. The first decision they made that they hide this secret from everyone, even from their relatives and the people in the castle. At the same time, they would get the best doctor for their son. They provided provided him with the best possible medical care. After that, he had another problem, but this problem was in the level of the state. The Russian Empire, since when it was ruled by the Romanov family, has continued to expand, and every king who came was expanding the empire more and more. Nikolai had his eyes on Japan. It was believed that they were an easy target, but at that time, 1904, Japan was one of the powerful countries in the world. The whole world at that time was witnessing the era of industrial revolution. Japan in particular was advancing very quickly in this field. They were creating for themselves a terrifying arsenal of military. The Russian Empire at that time, the strongest assets for them was the naval fleet, the sea fleet. King Nicholas directed his instruction to the fleet command that they would attack the Japanese fleet. The Russian fleet was surprised by the devastating Japan force. They destroyed 3 of the largest and most powerful battleships. Imagine this person who was pushing the King Nicholas for this losing battle, no one but his uncle Sergei. He was kept telling him, let us fight, let us conquer this country. He kept whispering to him until he declared war on them. Surprisingly, every advice and everything came close to this person turns into disaster. As Russians' attacks with Japan was failed engagement, and they lost almost every round of the war. They lost almost every battle that was between them, meaning the year 1904 was one of the worst years for Nikolai. He failed the wars against Japan, and he had a son who had a serious illness. Of course, for him, this second issue was the worst. I mean, he spent 10 years waiting for the heir, and as soon the heir came, he came with a disease. It was a disaster, greater than any disaster. As all of his focus and focus of his wife, Alexandra, was on Alexei, imagine that he left the management of the war to his uncle. Putin was continuing his Belgium trip, and his reputation preceded him, and spent several years moving from city to city while playing the role of the monk who heals people. At that time he was drinking, getting drunk, committing debauchery. Since he now has a high social status between people, this made it easy for him to set his hand on any woman he wanted. On the contrary, he was marketing himself to women that he will give them their blessing and will heal them when they let him do whatever he wants. We already know what he wants. They believed him. And in fact, most of his followers was women who was deceived by him. I mean, come on, in the name of everything, where does the blessing comes from a guy looks like this? No, and after that, he tells that he did not shower or clean himself. This was part of his rituals in his religion. His smell was unbelievably stinky. After all of that, with his smell, with his looks, everything was going smoothly and right for him. Everything believed that he was a blessed man. Believe it or not, this is an historical fact. This man, Rasputin, was so smart and has the amount of intelligence that he would deceive all of these people to believe what he wants and take whatever he wants from them. During his Belgium, or precisely his journey of degeneracy, Rasputin arrived in the city of St. Petersburg, which was the capital of Russia at that time. There, Rasputin met the priest of the largest church in the country, the priest who is close to the ruling family at that time. This priest welcomed Rasputin and all the priests and bishops of the church. They had heard about him and his blessing and his spiritual abilities to heal people. And people began to come to him even from the nobility class, the high class, wanting to see his miracle and all of his blessings. Rasputin began to practice his rituals on them and began to speak to them and hear them out, making them feel that he was treating them. And of course, as we said, he was manipulating the psychological part of these people. Many of his advices and tips was very good and very logical to make the people feel good and make them feel calm and trust him immediately. People were always comfortable with him. He knew exactly what to say at what time to relieve their suffering. At the same time, the King Nicholas and his wife Alexandra were extremely stressed and upset because of the condition of their son, which was getting worse and worse, and yet they placed on themselves the burden of keeping a secret from everyone. It would be more easier if they announced the condition of their son, but they did not want the people to see the heir of the throne, a weak person, die at any time. This was the situation inside of the castle, and the situation outside of the castle was worse and worse and worse. Russia is losing its battles and wars day by day, and because of this, the Russian people at home are suffering from shortage of food and supplies, and the difficulties of life starting to increase. This thing started the demonstration, and people started to group up and demanding changing to the country. Even at that time, some revolutionary parties had the extreme approach. They were trying to kill the king himself, and the king did not know how bad is it. None of his advisors, led by his uncle, was giving him the true picture of what was happening in his country. He did not care how much the public movements that were taking place. He thought they were just a matter of time, everything would go to normal. But imagine crowds of people and large group of creeping towards the castle. These people were not calling for the overthrow of the king. On the contrary, they were saying, God save the king. The goal of the demonstration was to reforms and asks for rights, not to overthrow or kill the king, because the government is failing and the people are suffering. They were demanding a council, a public council, to present themselves and to have a hand in the country's decisions. But these demonstrations faced with a high level of violence by the order of the uncle's King Sergei. The armies and the soldiers were gathered to prevent the demonstrations from approaching to the castle. And imagine it came to this extent that the soldiers were drawing a line under the ground and they were daring the demonstrators to cross this line. But the demonstration did not care and cross it anyways. After that, a massacre appeared. The soldiers started shooting everyone who passed this line. And imagine it came even to the people who were in the street who did not cross this line. They also got shot and killed thousands of people who were just naming in the name of the king. This was an important turn point in the history of Russia. For many people, after this massacre, they lost hope for their king, the ruler, King Nicholas, and started to join the revolutionary parties who were initially calling for the overthrow of the king and his party. Many of these revolutionary people began to carry out the explosive operations. The king's uncle Sergei himself was going out one day in his carriage, and one person walked next to the car and threw a bomb. The car in seconds turned into ashes. Many of the common people were so happy that the king's uncle Sergei was dead. On the contrary, in the castle, Nikolai the king was so shocked about this news. Finally, he began to understand the extent of what was happening in his country. These were not ordinary demonstrations. These people were revolting and rebelling to the maximum. What made things worse was that at the same time, the condition of the war in the east with Japan were getting worse. Imagine that Nikolai had to call in the main Russian fleet. The Baltic Sea Fleet is located in this spot in western Russia. So imagine this fleet traveling all this distance around the world, around Africa or Asia, from west to east, to confront the Japanese fleet. In the end, after this epic journey, the Japanese fleet defeated them for only 40 minutes. Imagine, a whole war ended in 40 minutes. A great war between two great countries, Russia and Japan, ended in only 40 minutes. Imagine you brought your main fleet and made them travel around the world and leaving a very strategic places in Europe. And after all of this, it ends in 40 only minutes. This loss made the rebellion more aggressive. The king's advisors told him that we reached a situation that requires some forms and concessions. The situation calls for some establishment for the elected public council to have a hand in making the country's decisions, and people feel that they have a hand in ruling the country. The uncle's King Sergei was so disagreeing of making a public council to the public. But the uncle is dead, and the absolute power still remains to the king. This council was only a show. And in fact, in the year of 1905, this council was established and they called it the Duma Council. This council was almost just a form, as we said, just a show to make people more calm down. With all of these concessions, the people calmed down waiting for the reforms to come up. In this same period, an accident happened to the Prince Alexei, the king's boy. He was with his mother in the castle garden. While he was playing and running, he fell and injured his leg. But the wound was not big, and his health condition decreased and he went into bed. His father and mother brought him the best doctors in the city. The doctor had no solution other than giving him some calm medicines, but the little prince's condition continued to get worse, and his mother Alexandra was very nervous for him and very tense. This was a turning point for the king and the queen because they heard from people around them that there is a blessed monk who heals and treats people, and his name was Rasputin. Rasputin arrived to the castle with the summons of the king Nikolai himself. Alexandra, as soon as Rasputin entered the room, she felt a very strange and strong presence, as if a blessed person had descended from the heaven. Imagine. This is the impression that Rasputin tried to leave when he entered any place. Everyone around him believes that he is truly a great and blessed man. Before the king and his wife say anything to Rasputin, Rasputin said to them, "I know why you summoned me." And the king told him why, and Rasputin answered him and said, "You summoned me to treat your little prince." Nikolai and Alexandra was so shocked. How did he know? This was a secret matter. Rasputin continued his words and said, "Last night I had a vision from God himself. And in this vision I saw a little prince was suffering and he was going to die without me. His destiny and my destiny was inevitable." Of course, Rasputin most likely had the news leaked to him from one of the nobles who knew about the matter, about the prince's illness. It ain't no vision or nothing. But when Nikolai and Alexandra heard the words of this Rasputin, they became very convinced that this is a blessed man and he only has to prove it by healing their son. They are already a religious people who love the church and love the monks and love the priests, especially Alexandra, who still believed in the spiritual and powerful things. So Rasputin entered the Prince Alexei room and approached the bed, became close to the bed. Then he put his hand on the prince's head and began his rituals and began muttering, began to say some powerful stuff. The strange thing is, during the several days, the Prince Alexei condition improved. Okay, now you come to me and tell me this is a real disease. This is not a psychological condition. How come Rasputin treats it and heals it? There is two explanations of what happened. The first one was the Prince Alexandra's mother. His mother was the most lonely, stressed and worried about his situation, and she was in a very bad psychological state all the time. As I told you, she was in the verge of collapsing. When Rasputin began to reassure the mother and guide her, Alexandra naturally calmed down. At least his condition did not get worse. The mother was essential key in the treatment. But the second key, and most importantly, Rasputin stopped the treatment and the medication that the doctors were giving to Alexei. When Alexei entered these times of pain and tiredness, the doctor was giving them aspirin, and the aspirin is usually a pain relief. But in our modern area, we discovered that the aspirin is very bad for the hemophilia condition because it's reducing the blood clotting more and more, so it's making the condition double. When Rasputin prevented the doctors and their medication from Alexei's condition improved. The matter was no magic, no blessing, no anything. It was just a coincidence. We wanna see this guy buy some lottery because obviously Rasputin did not know that this aspirin was bad for his condition. He just did not believe in the medicine, so he stopped the medicine. It's really something strange how things done in this way. From this point, Rasputin was so close from the king and the queen, especially Alexandra, who began to see him that he is like a king of mercy, was descending from the heaven. She began to praise him, appreciate him, and began to listen to all of his directions and words, even in matters that did not concern her son. The king also began to appreciate Rasputin and give him a high position. The situation remained like this for a while, and Rasputin somehow became part of the ruling family, always present with them in their photos. And any meeting the king he attends with him and give him his advice and opinions as if he's like one of his advisors. King's advisors were so shocked. Where did this Rasputin came from? How did he got this high class immediately and suddenly? Of course, most of them did not know about the little prince's illness condition. They did not know how did this relationship between the king's family and the Rasputin started from. This thing left a jealousy in themselves for Rasputin. Rasputin became a fact and everyone has to accept it. and his influence over the king and the queen increases day by day. At that time, the demonstration increased again, and the people began to revolt again because they discovered that the Duma Council that the king had established was just a show. All decisions are still in his hand and nothing is improved in the country. The situation was chaos, demonstrations everywhere, the army was killing everyone in the streets, acts of sabotage, executions in hundreds, and destruction were taking place all over the Russian land. The prime minister at that time was a man named Pyotr Stolypin. This man was trying with all of his effort to reform and solve problems. Despite that, imagine that the revolutionaries blew his house. They suddenly entered his house and threw bags containing explosions and quickly fled. And seconds later, the explosion destroyed most of the house. Prime Minister Stolypin miraculously survived the explosion, but many of the guards and people who were present in the house died, and his daughter was also seriously injured. Despite all this, he continued to try make reforms in the countries. He did not turn against the people, but there was a big problem was facing him inside of the castle itself. The king did not listen to his words or his advice. Rasputin was directing the king and advising him that he would not submit to the people and the demonstrators, would not make any privileges. He tells him that you are the king of this country by the will of God, and you are forbidding from allowing anyone to stand against this divine will. Rasputin always links his words to religion, and the king and his wife were very religious, so his words always influenced him. He kept motivating the king by standing up to his people and stopping these demonstrations by fire and bullets. It seems that there is a confrontation between the Prime Minister Stolypin and Rasputin, who was very upset and surprised how did Rasputin have such a strong influence on the king. Rasputin's hatred was not only to the Prime Minister, even the bishops of the church seemed to hate Rasputin when they previously loved him and understood him. But Rasputin began to despise them, and at every opportunity was given to him, he began to mocking them and underestimating their status. So the bishops of the church were still at the peak of their anger. At the same time, they were not able to do anything. Everyone knew that the Rasputin's status in the royal family became higher than anyone else. The Queen Alexandra in particular became dependent on him more than any other human being in the universe. Dependent on him even more than her husband, because he was the only person who was able to guide her and reassure her. Of course, while all of this happening, Rasputin did not give up or abandon all of his immoralities or degeneracy doings. Most of his followers and fans were still women, so he used to approach them, deceive them, and keep telling them sweet words until he takes what he needs from them. Are talking about women even from the noble families who have husbands and children. Despite all of this, they were lining up in front of Rasputin and were in love with him. Something really strange. There were even rumors that were spreading that Rasputin was controlling the queen herself, but although these rumors has not been confirmed, these rumors was used systematically to castrate the picture of the kings and his family, with them Rasputin. It was drawings and articles and photos shared among the people shows the Rasputins and the queen in a very disgraceful positions. This was one of the methods that were used by the people to attack the kingdom during the demonstrations and the riots. A lot of hatred and anger was directed at Rasputin's. People were surprised, who is this rural peasant farmer who began to manipulate the ruling family and the entire state? From here, the character of Rasputin began to become famous historically. Even everyone's attention became directed at him, and the result was that haters of Rasputin began to increase every day, whether from relatives of the ruling family and the noble class, or from the priest, or even from the general public. There was a united hatred in Russia against Rasputin. Even the Duma Council began attacking the kings through their attacks on Rasputin, because of course they were not able to attack the kings directly. Despite all of this, the relationship between the king and the queen with Rasputin has not been weakened. On the contrary, it became even stronger. They were genuinely believing this is a blessed man who was sent to them by God. With the increase of Rasputin's enemies, it was only a matter of time when someone tried to harm Rasputin or even kill him. One day, when Rasputin was walking in the field, he came across a woman who looked like a beggar, someone asking for money. She kept asking him to help her, so he put his hand in his pocket to get her some money. Suddenly, this woman pulled out a knife and stabbed him in his chest. Despite that stab was deep, but Rasputin was able to recover from it after spending some few days in bed. And this woman, they later discovered that she was sent by some of her priests. Some priests that had a good relationship with Rasputin, but later this relationship turned into hatred against him. From this point, Rasputin began to fear for his life and began to feel more anxious. The year 1940 came, and at that time World War I started to begin. Rasputin, despite his encouragement to the king to stop the demonstrations and oppose the people, he disagreed about the war and was urging the king to not enter it. The beginning of World War I was some fight between Serbia and Austria, and Serbia was an ally for Russia, but Austria, on the other hand, was an ally for Germany, the greatest military world at that time. So if Russia entered the fight between Serbia and Austria, it means that they are conflicting a war against Germany also. So Rasputin advised the king not to enter the war, no matter what. He kept telling him that this war would be a loss for the Russian Empire and might end them. But the strange thing is that the king did not listen to his advice at this time. Perhaps maybe because he did not have an option. Serbia, they're like their people, they were family, they were part of the Russian land. So how could the Russian king allow something like Austria to enter Serbia and attack it? This thing that caused Germany to enter the war that started the World War I, and Rasputin prophecies was soon fulfilled. Was right. The Russian force, which were mostly made of peasants and farmers and simple people, were not able to stand against the German arsenal and its soldiers, who were trained at the highest level. Russians seemed to retreat and lose a lot of territory to the German forces. This war did not need a prophecy from Rasputin to predict that the war is going to be a loss for Russia, especially after its defeats in Japan. But regardless of the defeat, the king came back and knew the value of Rasputin again. He thinks that if he listened to his words and advice, the situation might have been better. Rasputin gave the kings another piece of advice, which was that he take himself and lead his soldiers on the front lines. This means that he will be at the head of the army instead of sitting in the castle. The king actually heard Rasputin's word this time and decided to go out and lead the army himself. Many people knew all along that Rasputin actually wanted to seize power for himself. So if the king was not on the capital, the queen will have the final decisions, and the queen was literally a puppet in Rasputin's head. So we can say during this period Rasputin was almost a king of Russia. This farmer was a king of Russia. We have reached the year 1916, and it will be almost 2 years since the beginning of the war. During these 2 years, the public anger against the kings and the ruling family reached a maximum level, especially with the defeats that the Russian army witnessed in all of the battles of the war. And on the contrary, the king's leadership of the army made things very worse because he did not have any military experience whatsoever. Meanwhile, in the capital, the degree of tension was increasing day by day. All of the Russia, with its different classes, became against Rasputin. Rasputin at that time felt afraid that his death could come at any moment at the hands of anyone. He was particularly afraid of the king's relatives, the nobles, who had hated and despised him because he was in control of the kings and the queen, and therefore in the control of the country. Rasputin wrote a letter to the king in which he said in this letter, "There is a disaster is about to become. The day of judgment will come to our country, and we will all drown in our own blood. I feel the end is approaching. If I die at the hands of one of your nobles' relatives, this will be the end of Russia as we know it today. and it will be after the end of your family and your rule. None of you will survive. Rasputin sends these letters to the kings because he wanted to make him feel the sensitivity of the issue. He wanted to say, keep your relatives away from me. Period. But the king at that time was so far away on the western side, his last concern was that he was thinking about Rasputin and his relationships with his relatives and nobles and the people in the castle. Nikolai did not give any attention to this message. Time passes, and one day one of the king's relatives called Rasputin. This was a young man named Felix Yusupov, a prince from a very wealthy family in Russia. And he was in fact married to the king's niece, meaning he was a relative. This man was angry from Rasputin and have so much hatred about him. He hated how the queen became a puppet in his hand. He hated the gossips and rumors that spread among people that the queen was in love with him. He was seeing him as a mark of disgrace in the ruling family. One day this Felix called Rasputin and introduced himself and told him, I was hoping to make an appointment with you because my wife had a personal health problem. We want you to visit us in our house so we can tell you about it. We need your help. Even when Rasputin was a little bit worried, it will be a strange thing if he refused an invitation from a nobleman like Felix. I mean, it's nothing strange for some noble to ask for his medical help. After that, he responds to Felix and said, okay, tomorrow evening I will be there. I will see your wife's problem and treat it. The next day, Prince Felix and his men begin to prepare their plan. They prepared drinks and food for Rasputin, but these drinks and food were filled with potassium cyanide poison stuck inside the cakes and drinks. Felix now wants to kill Rasputin with poison, so he invited him to sit down and told him to go ahead and take your time. Told him the place is yours, eat wherever you want. Then he started pouring him a drink. He literally put poison in everything on the table except for one type of drink they knew that Rasputin hated. But he kept drinking and eating cakes as if was nothing on it. I mean, this is a potassium cyanide. He was supposed to kill him immediately and he's chilling? No, and not showing any sign of poisoning. Felix excused himself and went to his men who were waiting for him to outside of the room and told them that Rasputin was sitting, eating and drinking. Nothing happened to him. The group was surprised at how this thing was possible. So they told Felix, okay, you have to kill him yourself. So Felix takes a gun and goes back to the room, and as soon as Rasputin turns around, he was surprised by Felix, who was pointing a gun at him. Felix shot Rasputin in the chest, but he fell to the ground immediately. After they heard the shot, Felix and the nobles who were waiting for him entered. They saw Rasputin on the ground. When Felix approached him to check on him, suddenly Rasputin wake up and grabbed Felix by the neck and threw him to the side. Then he got up and ran through the castle and reached the door. He started running in the outer courtyard while struggling from his injury. Felix and those with him were chasing him and trying to shoot him, while they were shocked and unable to understand how did this creature was still alive. They kept chasing him and shooting him until they reached the outer gate, which was closed. And there they shot him, and even after he fell this time they continued shooting him until they were sure that he was dead. Then they took his body, removed it and threw it into the river, and that was the end of Rasputin. That was the end of Rasputin. Tough cookie he was. Rasputin is dead, and when they found his body in the lake frozen, most of the Russian people got this information with joy, but the royal family, specifically the king and the queen, went in state of sadness and mourning. Then the king decided to return again and center on the western front to lead the war. But this was the worst possible time for him to leave the capital, because the protests and riots have reached their peak, and this revolution is now being led by extremist parties, led by people they called Bolsheviks, and they were led by a man called Vladimir Lenin, who would later be the founder of the Soviet Union after the Romanov family fell. The fall of the family was inevitable, fatal, as Rasputin predicted precisely. The demonstrations literally began and did not stop. The king himself sent orders to soldiers. They began to separate the people by force, so the victims die with the highest numbers, and it became a massacre in front of the castle. Despite the massacre and the victims, people did not retreat and continued to rush toward the castle and begin to push the gates. At this time, on the battlefronts, The Russian soldiers, many of whom were peasants and ordinary people, farmers, began to disobey their commanders, and instead of directing their weapons at their enemies, they began to direct their weapons at their leaders. They declared their disobedience to the military orders, and from now, thousands of splits have appeared in the ranks of the Russian army. Many soldiers were leaving in front of lines and returning to Russia to join their families. The soldiers who disobeyed, what happened to them now? They are now some protesters who have weapons. This is the first time who the protesters have weapons. The balance seemed to have turned now. The army itself joined to the revolution. So it was clear that this is the end of the king's family. As soon as the news reached the king, he moved his train and headed for the capital again. The king's advisors warned him at this moment that he would give the throne away, because things are now under the control of the revolutionaries, and all he can do now is to try to save himself and his family. He must abandon the throne now. Indeed, the king announced his abdication of the throne, an urgent telegram to the National Assembly, and announced his abdication of the king. The revolutionary at that time took control of the castle, and there was soldiers from the revolutionary standing at the gates of the castle. The king's family, no one harmed them, but they became detained inside the castle. And when Nicholas arrived at the place, the scene was very painful for him. The soldiers there, they treated him in a humiliating manner, not as if he had ruled over them yesterday. The important thing is Nicholas met his family for the second time. This time there were two powers fighting for the power in Russia. The Duma Council, which is People's Assembly, and the Soviet Revolutionary Council. One of these members was a man named Alexander Klinsky. And this Alexander was assigned to establish a temporary government. Klinsky himself told Nikolai that he will be safe with his life and the life of his family. The temporary government would protect them. Even Klinsky was one of the first revolutionaries to call for the overthrow of the king and the ruling family. In the end, his goal was not killing them, most likely. The king and his family will remain in custody for a while and then will be either banished to another country or remain permanently in a known place. But unfortunately, Klinsky's temporary government, which was guaranteeing the king's protection, did not continue due to the country's unstable condition. And Klinsky and his temporary government were overthrown within 3 months. But the revolutionaries and Bolsheviks party in particular, that was led by Vladimir Lenin, imagine that Lenin spent 20 years of his life asking and demanding the death of the family, the ruling family and his king, and now the fate of the royal family was in his hand. In May 1980, Lenin, after he took complete control of the power, he issued an order to a secret police unit to carry out a special mission. This mission was assembled by a unit of selected soldiers to carry it out. Soldiers that were completely loyal to the case. This unit was ordered to transfer the royal family at one of the secret houses. They gathered the family of the former king in the house, which was almost like a prison. Even the windows has a prison bars, but the family was still optimistic in some way. They believed that they are most likely would be banished to another country like British or something like this. What did they not know that the Bolsheviks' hatred from them was much greater than allowing them to escape their grip easily. These people had hatred towards the royal family for many years. Their leader, Lenin himself, wanted to execute the king, but after that he did not want to settle this matter publicly. He did not want to make a show. This was the purpose of this secret house, that they was isolated in it. This house was in an area that was entirely belonging to the group. All the people and all the army that was surrounding the house had all the same hatred toward the royal family. They all wanted to see this family die and disappear. They even reached to the point that they want their land to become extinct. After 2 months of detaining the king's family in his house, when they were sure that everything was ready, the soldiers entered on them one night and said to them, "We want you to be dressed and ready as soon as possible." Nikolai and his family were surprised. Nikolai asked them what happened and told him, "You will be transferred secretly to England." Nikolai and his family took this news very happily. They were expecting this thing at the end. So the soldiers took them down to the underground. Nikolai and his family They imagined that they were smuggling them under the ground. Then they entered the room alone and told them to sit here for a while and wait, and locked the door on them. Nikolai and his family waited for a while in this room. The soldier returned and their commander took out a piece of paper and began to read. What is on this paper? By the order of the leadership of the revolution, the former king Nikolai and his family were sentenced to death. The sentence is to be carried out immediately. Suddenly the soldiers took out their pistols and opened fire on the entire family, Nikolai, his wife, and their children, and shot them all to death. Crazy historical scene. They executed everyone. Even some news said that they had some dogs and some servants. They even killed them. And you know what is worst? After they fired a crazy amount of fire on them, many of them were still alive, especially the girls. They were not dead yet. They were not injured and screaming. How could that happen? They put some diamonds and some jewelry inside of their clothing. Nicola and his family expected that they would be banished to another country, so they took their jewelry and put them inside of their clothes so that no one would take it from them. When this massacre happened and the soldiers started to shoot them, the jewelry became like a bulletproof vest, but at the same time they did not stop the bullets. The bullets would hit them and injure them, but they would not kill them. So imagine, other than it was a massacre, it was a very painful killing. The soldiers kept shooting them and shooting them. Many of the girls were still alive and screaming with a clear voice, so they were forced to go on them and finish them with their knives. This means that it was a massacre as horrific as possible. And of course the instructions said that this mission has to be a secret, so they took their bodies and buried them and then dissolved them with acids. Breaking Bad scene. So no trace were left, and the remains of them were taken in a far place and buried. This was the end of the last royal family that ruled Russia. And then the Soviet Union began at the hand of the Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin. These historical stories make someone think. I mean, imagine if the King Nikolai did not know Rasputin, how our world would be now. Or imagine if he had some better advisor than his uncle Sergei, how could Russia be now? Anyways, we have reached to the end of our story. I hope this story taught you something, made you wonder about this historical stuff. Thank you for watching. Peace out. Peace, boys, peace, peace.